Welcome to Muslim Apologetics Australia. A video was published on April 22nd of 2019 where David Wood and Sam Shamoun make a video discussing, does the Old Testament mention the Son and the Holy Spirit? David Wood and Sam Shamoun answer this question. And it says here in their description, Muslims will often claim that the Holy Spirit and the Son Jesus are nowhere mentioned in the Old Testament, and thus alluding to the Trinity being something made up. Let's see what Sam Shamoun and David Wood has to say about this. So they're basically saying that the Trinity being made up is false, and it's there in the Old Testament. Apparently, Sam Shamoun is now trying to help David Wood, trying to probably convince him because he got a beating against Brother Muhammad Hijabi. Sam Shamoun looks like he's forcing David Wood. I mean, look at David Wood's. His face doesn't look very convincing. So Sam Shamoun probably invites David Wood to say, look. We need to convince the Muslims that yes, the Trinity is in the Old Testament. It's there. The Son is mentioned, the Holy Spirit is mentioned, and the Son as Jesus in specific is mentioned. It's not made up. The Trinity is there in the Old Testament. So let's go back to the debate and see what David Wood has said to Muhammad Hijabi. But before we do that, let's listen to these babbleheads.
Then you send the Spirit, He creates them, meaning resurrects them, and you replenish the earth He ascribed to the Spirit belonging to Jehovah. Now go to Job 33, verse 4. Job 33.
Of the Almighty gives me life.
So the Spirit made Job, made man, because He's replenishes the earth, attributes of...
So they're going and showing how the Spirit is there.
The Trinity in the Old Testament and the deity of Christ in the Old Testament and the deity of the Spirit in the Old Testament, these are all topics that I'm sure we'll be covering over and over again.
Yes. And so I think this one, because it's the most powerful, we're going to look at Proverbs 30, verses 3 and 4. So let me repeat. The Son has been active throughout the Old Testament, but in the Old Testament, we have less references to Him as the Son as we do in the New Testament. So He is the Son in the Old Testament, but He's not identified as the Son with the frequency we find in the New Testament. So I'm going with this one because this is the most explicit in my view. Proverbs 30, verses 3 and 4, but just read 3 first. So we can
I have not learned wisdom, nor have I knowledge.
With the Spirit.
Go with Son. We can go into more detail. Deity of the Trinity in the Old Testament and the deity of Christ in the Old Testament and the deity of the Spirit in the Old Testament. These are all topics that I'm sure we'll be covering over and over again.
So with Sam Shamoun in a private video, he's saying that the Trinity is there in the Old Testament. It's there. You know, it's the topic. The Son is there. The Holy Spirit is there. The Father's there. The Trinity is there, folks. So let's see what he says to Muhammad Hijabi.
According to Muhammad Hijabi, we'd have to say, why didn't they know this earlier stuff then? Why didn't they have the same knowledge? Well, Christians and Muslims believe in progressive revelation. God can give more. Now think about what God did there. He's giving a covenant, a new covenant. Back then, we call it the old covenant now, but back then it was a new covenant. He's giving a new covenant, and He says, I'm giving you a new covenant, and I'm going to reveal more about myself to you. So, according to the Old Testament, what does God do when He brings a new covenant? Well, the pattern is He gives them a deeper understanding of who He is. So, why doesn't the Trinity just clearly why doesn't the Old Testament clearly define the doctrine of the Trinity? Well, in the Old Testament as well. So, why doesn't the Trinity just clearly define, why doesn't the Old Testament clearly define the doctrine of the Trinity? Well, in the Old Testament as well, Jeremiah chapter 31. So, why doesn't the Trinity just clearly define, why doesn't the Old Testament clearly define the doctrine of the Trinity? Well, in the Old Testament as well, Jeremiah chapter 31, a new covenant is coming. It's prophesied in the future. The big one is coming. The big covenant is coming. Well, don't you think God's got some more information in store for the people of the new covenant when this new covenant comes? I do. And who brings the new covenant? Well, Jesus. It's Jesus entering the world and then the Holy Spirit being poured out where we find out about the inner life of God. And then the Holy Spirit being poured out where we find out about the inner life of God. And this is correlated with God's plan of salvation.
4 minutes left.
So, why isn't it clearly mentioned? Well, that's how God works. Progressive revelation. He does this throughout the Bible. He keeps giving them more and more information.
Listen again, the Trinity is not clearly mentioned in the Old Testament.
So, why isn't it clearly mentioned? Well, that's how God works. Progressive revelation. He does this throughout the Bible. He keeps giving them more and more information.
Because that's how God works. That's why it's not clearly mentioned. The Trinity is not clearly mentioned in the Old Testament because God gives progressive information, new revelation. So how does Sam Shamoun and David Wood sit there trying to prove to us the Trinity in the Old Testament when David Wood got up and stood and did a debate against Muhammad Hijabi? And even there he admitted the Trinity is not clearly defined. It's not mentioned.
The big one is coming. The big covenant is coming. Well, don't you think God's got some more information in store for the people of the new covenant when this new covenant comes?
So the new information, the real information, more information that will prove the Trinity, where is their reliance? It's the New Testament. It's not the Old Testament. So I really laugh out loud seeing that David Wood admits that it's not clearly mentioned in the Old Testament, and that's why they try and prove plurality. They try and say Jesus was here and the Holy Spirit was here, but they don't really see this communion, this connection. There isn't that clear Trinity doctrine shown in the Old Testament. David Wood agrees to that. And so what do? David Wood and Sam Shamoun plan to make another video after the debate, obviously, and to try where David Wood tries to convince Sam Shamoun, and Sam Shamoun tries to convince David Wood that there is the Trinity in the Old Testament. And as far as I'm concerned, it's not there, according to David Wood's own testimony, that it isn't clearly defined. It's not clearly defined there in the Old Testament. And David says it will come later on. The definition will come later on in the New Testament. So why are they then doing a video discussing the Old Testament where there's more proof in the Old Testament for the Trinity? They should be just discussing the New Testament. They shouldn't be discussing. But what do they do in this video? They discuss more from the Old Testament to prove the Trinity. But hang on a minute. David Wood said it's not there. It's not clearly defined in the Old Testament. So it seems to me that Sam Shamoun forced him to do this discussion, and David Wood doesn't really seem too interested. And so Sam Shamoun is trying to play the big brother here, the papa, to try and convince David Wood and to try and change his perspective, because David Wood clearly admitted it's not clearly defined in the Old Testament. And so we need the New Testament. A new revelation has to come to define what the Trinity is. These shonker Christians.